Hi, I'm Andrew Bazance, the artistic director and conductor of Eugene Opera. I've been part of Eugene Opera since 2008. I want to talk to you about the art of conducting, what a conductor does, and how conducting works. I think that if you study conducting even just a little bit, it greatly enhances your understanding of a score from rhythmic, stylistic, and interpretive perspectives. How did I become interested in conducting? Well, when I was young, I was a violinist and pianist, and I played in my school orchestra and was always in love with the idea of the orchestra and how that ensemble worked. And I was always very curious about that person up in front seeming to lead this entire group of many, many people and many artists. I often attended performances by my home orchestra, the Buffalo Philharmonic, and just loved the sound. I loved the experience of being in the hall, of hearing that great ensemble, and again, seeing that person up in front and being very curious as to what they were doing. As I continued to study music as a pianist, violinist, and ultimately French horn player, I always found myself attracted to the idea of conducting. In fact, my parents, on more than one occasion, found me conducting the backs of our living room chairs with some great recording on in the background. It was in college when a conducting teacher approached me and said that I had some ability with it and wanted me to study it privately, that my life really changed. I ended up pursuing my piano degree, which I ultimately got, but then I also studied conducting the entire time, well beyond what the school had to offer. And it was sort of around my senior year of college that I decided that conducting was really what I wanted my future to be about. So I ended up attending graduate school with a conducting degree and ended up working for my home orchestra after that for the Buffalo Philharmonic and got to conduct a lot of concerts with them before I started to pursue opera as my main area of focus as a conductor. So with all of that study, I got to really learn what a conductor does. A conductor has many roles in front of the ensemble, but we can boil it down to a few key points. One is they serve as the interpreter of the piece of music. This is really the primary goal. Each musician has in front of them their own part, but what a conductor does is provide some context for that part. Also, a conductor is expected to know the piece backwards and forwards, how the instruments work with the music that's in front of them, meaning you have to have a thorough knowledge of the instruments or voices you're working with, and also then the stylistic elements of the composer. You need to understand that Mozart is interpreted differently than Puccini, Stravinsky, John Adams, name it. So you need to spend a lot of time studying all that. And actually, much of the work of a conductor happens well in advance of ever stepping in front of any ensemble. It takes you months, maybe, sometimes over a year to really learn a piece thoroughly. When I have a new operatic score that I've never worked on before, I like to give myself almost 2 years of time to really embody the music. And that's another thing that we are doing up there on the podium. We are embodying the music physically, so we can help guide the performance in tempo, in articulation and rhythm, in just overall atmosphere, and of course, again, hopefully providing some real connection with the musicians in front of you to give a sense that you're all part of a whole. There's a little bit of a myth that, oh, you have to be just a big egomaniac to stand up in front of an orchestra or a choir or an opera company. And certainly you have to have the confidence of your preparation, but really it all comes from that preparation that you are able to stand up there. And again, a lot of this takes years of study. We're not going to get that involved in this video. This video is really to give you some fundamentals, which we'll talk about in a minute. The idea of a conductor in front of an ensemble is actually quite an old one. It goes all the way back to the 15th century, when small ensembles would have somebody giving rhythmic indication. By the time we move into the 16th and 17th centuries, conductors looked very different, not physically as people, but how they operated looked very different than what we see now on the podium in a concert hall. As a matter of fact, a conductor frequently used a very large staff that was almost the height of their at least shoulder width, and they would pound the floor with that staff to give the rhythm, to give the beat and tempo to the ensemble. But these were not big ensembles. And as a matter of fact, when we get to the end of the 18th century, conductors were not using this big staff anymore, but if they weren't using their hands, often they were using their instrument. As a matter of fact, many of the conductors in Mozart's time and Haydn's time were the leaders of the orchestra. It's a term that we sometimes now hear still in the UK. In the United States, we call that person by a German term, the Concertmeister, or concertmaster. And the concertmaster was responsible for leading the orchestra, and they would often stand up and play. Now, so the orchestra could see them. Now, if you are watching that fabulous movie Amadeus, which I encourage all of you to see at some point, the way that conducting is represented is actually historically inaccurate. It was very rare to have a person conduct whose sole role was to stand in front of the ensemble and lead it. More often than not, Mozart would lead from the harpsichord in the orchestra pit. The other thing that was very different was in those days, conductors didn't face the stage. They faced the audience. They would stand and face the audience with the orchestra in front of them. So it was a little bit of a modern interpretation in that film, but that's not really how it looked. Now, when we come to the idea of what we contemporarily think of as a conductor, it really falls on Felix Mendelssohn in the early part of the 19th century. Mendelssohn understood that orchestras were getting larger and larger and really needed somebody whose job it was solely to just stand in front and provide the orchestra with the rhythmic tempo, articulation, information that they needed. As a matter of fact, Mendelssohn was also one of the first conductors to go back into more recent history and perform works that had not been performed for years. He was a big advocate of Johann Sebastian Bach, whose music didn't really get performed all that much outside of Bach's lifetime. So we now have this idea of conductor as interpreter really coming to the fore. In the middle of the 19th century, it was two very prominent composers who really codified how we think about conducting nowadays. It still holds true to this day what they developed as their conducting philosophy. Those composers were the French composer Hector Berlioz, who's well known for his Symphonie Fantastique, among other compositions. And if you've never heard Symphonie Fantastique, go right away and listen to it. It's fantastic. And Richard Wagner, the titan of German opera composition. Both of those composers were in many ways responsible for the expansion of the orchestra. And as the orchestras got larger and ensembles got larger, the role of the conductor became even more important, not just for keeping the ensemble together, but again, as I said in the beginning, for providing context to all of those musicians that are there trying to do one piece at one time. They, in fact, both published treatises on conducting and their own personal conducting philosophies, and they ended up being sort of blueprints for how we still think of the role of a conductor nowadays. In the latter part of the 19th century, as these orchestras expanded and music became increasingly rhythmically complicated, the role of the conductor became even more prominent, with conductors like Arthur Nikisch at the end of the 19th century. In the 20th century, Arturo Toscanini, Leopold Stokowski, Herbert von Karajan, and then we have on the American side, Leonard Bernstein, Thomas Skippers, Michael Tilson Thomas, all of these conductors who have become very famous for their interpretive ability, their ability to cohesively put together an ensemble in an orchestra or in an opera company and really give music a personal interpretation. I'm going to come back to that in one second, but I want to make a sidebar point, which is you may have noticed that all of the names I just mentioned were men. Unfortunately, for much of history, until very recently, female conductors have been discouraged from pursuing the profession. But luckily, that has really started to change, and there have been some big pioneers in that. One of them is my great mentor and friend to this day, music director of the Buffalo Philharmonic, Joanne Falletta. Joanne Falletta was a young student at Juilliard when she decided to put together her own orchestra out on Long Island and would get all of her friends at Juilliard to come and play as she studied conducting. And she ended up studying with Sexton Ehrling and really was one of the first female conductors to break that glass ceiling, and so many have followed since, and it's really a nice change to see that this is now becoming more and more common, and that nobody should be ever afraid to pursue this if you have the passion for it. That's really changing, and that's a really terrific thing. One last thing about interpretation and conducting. We had at the beginning of the 20th century two very different styles of approaching the score. One can be embodied by sort of a composer like Otto Klemperer, a conductor like Otto Klemperer, who took the musical raw materials that a composer provides and sort of really interpreted them. Sort of, sometimes they would add instruments to the original orchestration, things of that nature. On the other hand, and this is a lot more of how we think about things nowadays, was Arturo Toscanini, who believed that the composer's intention must be served first. And in our third video, when I talk about preparing music, that's one of the things that we're really going to focus on, which is composer's intent and how we study that and understand it. Conducting really is a fantastic thing to do. And as I said at the beginning of this video, of these 3 videos, I think if you can just learn it a little bit, it will help you understand the music that you're working on, whether or not you're going to conduct an ensemble, even better, just because it gives you so much more information and, in a way, allows you to physicalize the music in a way that you don't do just sitting at your instrument or sitting in choir. So our next video is going to be just some fundamentals of conducting. I'll give you the basics of what you need to do to understand what we're doing when we stand in front of an ensemble.